Hello and welcome to today's talk by Sandro Mezzadra titled The Capitalist Virus, Mutations of Capitalism in the Pandemic Conjuncture. This talk is hosted by the University of London Institute in Paris, and it takes place in the context of our seminar series, Theory in Crisis, which we launched last year, and has been continuing this year with a series of talks fundamentally aimed at kind of reconsidering the activity of theorizing in times of crisis, considering how such moments exacerbate the challenge of periodizing and representing any experience of the present. To give a very quick overview of some of the sorts of themes and problematics we've been considering, and the starting point here was to think about the relationship between different levels and understandings of crisis. So it's been understood as an intrinsic aspect of capitalism because capitalist reproduction depends upon exacerbating violent contradictions in the pursuit of growth. But at specific historical moments, these endemic tendencies break out into more generalized crises in which the given social formation can no longer be reproduced on existing bases of social compromise. At such moments, actors struggle within new conditions of tumult and uncertainty. The beginning of the neoliberal period marked one such period of crisis, but periodizing in this way also poses a particular set of challenges. The distribution of crisis, like any experience of the present, is highly uneven and produces coexisting and contradictory temporalities, structured across race, class and gender-based, as well as geographical and geopolitical divisions. The long history of racial capitalism points to continuities that demand we reconsider the apparent exceptionalism or ruptures represented by more recent tumults. Today's speaker has a body of work which offers a particularly insightful set of resources for analysing temporal and historical questions in the theorisation of contemporary capitalism, and his talk today, as the title suggests, is more specifically focused on the pandemic conjuncture. To briefly introduce Sandro then, he's a professor of political theory at the University of Bologna, and he's an adjunct research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society of Institute for Culture and Society of Western Sydney University. He has been visiting professor and research fellow in several international universities. In the last decade, his work has been particularly centered on the relationship between globalization, migration, and political processes, on contemporary capitalism, as well as post-colonial thought and criticism. His books in English include In the Marxian Workshops, which builds on and develops recent readings of Marx to illustrate how a Marxian analysis of the production of subjectivity provides illuminating analytical tools for theorizing the present and the major upheavals of contemporary capitalism. With Brett Neilson, he is the author of Borders Method, or The Multiplication of Labour, which analyzes how borders, far from serving simply to block or obstruct global flows, have become essential devices for their articulation. In this book, considering how the boundaries between free and unfree labour have become blurred, their notion of the multiplication of labour decenters the orthodox Marxist focused on the salaried worker as the figure of class struggle in capitalism, to show how different subjects, from slaves to labour migrants, have been central to class struggle. Focusing on processes of what they refer to as differential inclusion, demonstrate how the figures who inhabit the world's borderscapes are not marginal subjects that subsist on the edges of society, but in fact central protagonists in the drama of composing space, time, and materiality of the social itself. This work builds on energetic rereadings and articulations between post-colonial theory, scholarship on racial capitalism, migrant studies, and new readings of Marx. With the politics of operations, Mezzadra and Neilson build on this work, this more recent book published in 2019 by Duke University Press, offering a rich and capacious account of the extractive and logistical operations fueling contemporary capitalist organization, alongside a consideration of new forms of politics and institutions emerging beyond the confines of the state. So today it's a real pleasure to welcome Sandro for the talk, as I mentioned, titled The Capitalist Virus, Mutations of Capitalism in the Pandemic Conjuncture. Before I hand you over to Sandro, just to say that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So please use the chat box on your screen to enter any questions during or at the end of the talk. and we'll have a bit of time to go through those. And then very briefly, to give you a heads up about the next talk in our series, it will take place on February the 18th, and it's a talk by Aaron Beninav, the author of Automation and the Future of Work. And Aaron's talk is provisionally entitled Post-Scarcity Economics. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you, Sandro.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for this thoughtful introduction. I would like to thank you and Davide Gallarcere for inviting me. I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon and to have the opportunity to participate in this challenging seminar series. Eugene was mentioned in the two books I have co-authored with Brett Neilson, and I have to say at the very beginning of my talk today that also the paper that lies behind my presentation has been co-written with Brett as a first step of a new project that we are pursuing together. Today I will touch upon what I consider some of the most pressing questions emerging from the pandemic conjuncture with respect to the mutations of capitalism, which always means for me, for us, first of all, also the mutations of labor. Allow me to start by saying something very general. Once again, in the wake of the outbreak of the pandemic, we have been confronted with many analyses announcing the end of globalization. It was definitely not the first time. Just think of 9/11 and of the global war on terror launched by the Bush administration after 9/11. It was also a moment in which the whole discourse of globalization was denounced as merely rhetorical or ideological. Today, the situation is quite strange in this respect, because we have to note that there is at least a notable exception with respect of this common sense on the end of globalization. And I am thinking of the president of the Popular Republic of China, Xi Jinping, who held last week, once again, a quite striking talk at the Davos Forum, celebrating globalization as the unstoppable trend of the time. It's something that we can keep in mind also for our discussion later, because I don't think I will be able to tackle the question of the tensions and conflicts surrounding today the world order and disorder. Anyway, the end of globalization. Well, it depends on how one understands globalization. But let me say that the discourse on the end of globalization has precise political implications on the left, since it often works as a framework within which a series of returns or recoils are celebrated. The return of the nation state, of Keynesianism, of the welfare state. I will come back to this point at the end of my talk. For now, let's start by saying something obvious, which means that the outbreak of the pandemic was a global phenomenon like no other. It took just a couple of weeks at the beginning of 2020 to turn what Donald Trump famously called the Chinese virus into a global one. I think the global spread of the virus has something to say about what I used to call with Brett actually existing global processes. The global spread of the virus was not at all smooth. It reflected and intensified the unevenness and inequalities that characterize the contemporary world. In many parts of the world, it hit racialized and subaltern people in selective ways. African Americans in the US, indigenous people in Brazil, and the poor in general in India, just to make 3 examples. Also, governments' reactions to the pandemic were highly differentiated, at least in the first months, ranging from the neo-Malthusian tones of Trump, Bolsonaro, Johnson, and the like, to the mix of social control and welfarist rhetoric in places as diverse as the European Union, South Korea, and China. I think that this diversification of the spread and the consequences of the virus is a good instantiation of the dialectic between homogeneity and heterogeneity that characterizes what I was calling before actually existing global processes that never worked according to the script, to the rhetorical script of a flat world that in a way characterized discussions of globalization in the 1990s and are often the polemical target of people announcing today the end of globalization. The economic and social impact of the pandemic has been anyway momentous across the world. And let me now make the point that has a lot to do also with the title of our seminar series. Crisis is once again the keyword of the day. From an economic point of view, there is apparently a connection between the current conjuncture and the prolonged temporality of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So 15 years under the sign of crisis, of a crisis that was working in different ways in different parts of the world, but nevertheless was the kind of blueprint of economic development over the last 15 years. Behind the pandemic, other crises loom, from the ecological one to the energetic one, while humanitarian and international crises proliferate. There are many people who talk about cascading crises, multiple crises. Even the European Commission talks about a polycrisis. What I would like to ask is whether this ubiquity of crisis did not lead to an emptying out of the notion of crisis itself. We should not forget that crisis management, at least since the 1970s, is a specific form of governmentality. Of a governmentality that does not aim to solve, to overcome the crisis, but rather to reproduce it as its material condition of working. From an economic point of view, we know very well that crisis has become, in the last decades, even more than in the past, a specific terrain of capitalist operations. Just think of the climate crisis today. So this is the reason why we ask whether it is not the case to de-emphasize the reference to crisis, to use it in a very specific way, and to look for a different conceptual language to make sense of current development. Sure, in the wake of the outbreak of the pandemic, there were multiple crises in the workings of capitalism. Financial markets plunged, supply chains were disrupted, industrial sectors were paralyzed. And we know very well that working people and the poor paid the highest price for those crises. The dramatic increase of inequality over the last 2 years has made living conditions critical for multitudes of people in many parts of the world, multiplying poverty and creating new conditions for exploitation. We are, of course, aware of this, and we continue to rise from the point of view of these working people and the poor. But I repeat, instead of emphasizing the dimension of crisis, we find it more productive to focus on the trends that, constantly working through multiple crises, are driving the development of capitalism, even in the framework of the pandemic. This is, of course, not to say that nothing new is happening. The opposite is true. Powerful shifts and disruptions are occurring. But we need to make sense of them from the angle of a systematic analysis of the operations of capital that lie at the heart of the current capitalist formation. We tend to agree with Adam Tooze, who wrote a brilliant book on the economic consequences of COVID, and who writes that 2020, the year of the pandemic, is merely a moment in a process of escalation. Multiple vectors of global change, environmental, economic, political, geopolitical, continue to shape the workings of capital. Taken together, I quote from Tooze's book, these trends form a dynamic parallelogram that makes de-escalation hard. It's not impossible to imagine. The great acceleration continues. So I'm not proposing to substitute crisis with acceleration, but I think that acceleration is quite an interesting angle on the trends that are reshaping capitalism in the current conjuncture. I come back more directly to the pandemic by saying that the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has been, from many points of view, a crisis of mobility. I think that the idea of a crisis of mobility is an important point of view on what is at stake for capitalism in the pandemic conjuncture. While the virus quickly spread across the channels of mobility that enable the global stretching of supply chains and the circulation of commodities, the slowdown and in many cases standstill of logistical operations were among the immediate consequences of the pandemic. Mobility of stuff, which means commodities, mobility of people, which means also migration, is of course a crucial force behind the global processes. And mobility was hit by the outbreak of the pandemic in a quite dramatic way. Indeed, the management of the pandemic crisis was primarily a management of mobility. A management of mobility which targeted both people and stuff, as I was saying. Let me say something about the mobility of people, and in particular about migration, which is a topic that is not often addressed in discussions of capitalism in the pandemic conjuncture. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, international borders were selectively closed with a reinforcement of the hygienic sanitary component of the border regime, while internal boundaries proliferated even more than in the recent past, circumscribing work sites and productive zones, administrative territories like municipalities and regions, and even individual bodies and private homes during the lockdowns. The pandemic had, of course, a huge impact on migration, on the conditions of migrants and refugees, both on the move and settled. Both for migrants on the move and for migrants settled, the pandemic engendered very often conditions of forced immobility. border crossing was made more difficult and dangerous. There was a proliferation of detention spaces. Think of quarantine ships in the Mediterranean. The condition of waiting and being stuck, being stranded, became the living condition for thousands and thousands of people in many parts of the world. But also think of the many migrants who were living already in what migration scholars call countries of destination, and whose reproduction and social life are predicated on informal economic circuits and related practices of mobility that were curtailed in many parts of the world, usually without the possibility for migrants to access public benefits. So the pandemic, for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees implied a condition of forced immobility. But this is only one side of the process. There is another side that we can define of forced mobility. Forced mobility of migrants was apparent in the experience of those working in sectors deemed essential by government, from agriculture to logistics and last mile delivery. Anyway, migration emerged out of the pandemic conjuncture once again as a constitutive force of our societies, and in particular of labor markets. And today, in many European countries, the need to recruit new migrants is continuously emphasized by the ruling classes in order to address labor shortages and demographic imbalances. So let's ask again, how was the crisis of mobility engendered by the pandemic managed? And let's think of mobility in terms of staff and people. You know that we were and we are confronted with supply chain disruptions. I think it is important to analyze supply chain disruptions, but at the same time, these disruptions demonstrated once again the crucial role of logistics in the working of contemporary capitalism. And logistics was one of the forces that played outstanding roles in the management of the mobility crisis. Government interventions and capital investments have created the conditions for logistics to adapt to the disruptions brought about by the pandemic. New routes are in the making as far as supply chains are concerned. New regional spaces are in the making, although we have to always keep in mind that the future of these new regional spaces also depends on the current international tensions. Anyway, I think that logistics, that in the first weeks of the pandemic seemed to undergo a profound crisis, has eventually emerged as even more crucial and strategic for the working of contemporary capitalism, precisely because it was able to contribute to the management of the mobility crisis that characterized the development of the pandemic. From another but related angle, digital platforms have emerged as capitalist actors capable to manage the mobility crisis. Just think of food delivery, which is an obvious example, but also think of a platform like Zoom that we are currently using. I cannot be in Paris today, and this is part and parcel of the mobility crisis I am talking about. Zoom allows us to manage this crisis and to talk. In the last 2 years, we have witnessed a further entrenchment of the operations of digital platform in the social and economic issues, but we have also witnessed processes of pronounced financialization of platforms. Again, a good example is Zoom. I think 2 years ago, really few people in Europe were familiar with Zoom. Zoom exploded after the outbreak of the pandemic. And in May 2020, its stock exchange capitalization surged the capitalization of General Motors, which is, I think, a good instance of the processes of financialization, of the new intertwining between financialization and digitalization that emerged over the last 2 years. And needless to say, Amazon has become even more powerful, not only from an economic point of view, but also from the point of view of its ability to be a kind of hegemonic actor. And Amazon instantiates a good connection between logistics and platforms. So I think that logistics and digital platforms that have a lot of things in common are doomed to play really crucial roles in the working of capitalism in the next future and in the composition of what we can call with Marx aggregate capital. I have mentioned before essential workers. Speaking of migration, I want to delve now a bit more in this notion. In the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak, the essential worker has emerged as a figure that both attracted hollow praise and experienced heightened vulnerability. At once indispensable and expendable, essential workers were those condemned to keep society ticking over under circumstances in which the social itself had been narrowed to the supply chain. Essential workers were those who could not withdraw into the safety of electronically mediated home-based labor, whose livelihoods depended on continued circulation and possible exposure to infection, but whose jobs were deemed necessary for the reproduction of capital and society. In a way, we can say that this notion of essential workers was, and in part continues to be, widespread at the global level. Needless to say, the classification of essential workers was different across countries or even within different subnational states or regions. A constant, though, in many parts of the world, was the association with jobs predominantly performed by migrant workers or feminized labor, meaning that the race and gendered component of essential work was one of its primary features. I repeat, the materiality of different contexts matters a lot. We have looked, for instance, at the definition and experiences of essential workers in such places like India and Mozambique, which are quite different among themselves, and again different from experiences in Europe and in the United States. But nevertheless, we think that it is possible to grasp common traits of the figure of essential workers. And we are convinced that essential workers provide us with a point of view from which we can analyze the composition of labor in contemporary capitalism, also beyond the conjuncture we are living through. So we ask, therefore, who are the essential workers? In the USA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, within the Department of Homeland Security, maintained in December 2020 that, I quote, the industries that essential workers support represent, but are not limited to, medical and healthcare, telecommunications, information technology systems, defense, food and agriculture, transportation and logistics, energy, water and wastewater, and law enforcement. End of quote. The list is wide and even quite generic. But nevertheless, I think it is possible to discern in this list some important traits of the figure of the essential worker. Anthropologist Andrew Lakoff stresses the focus in this list on the systems underpinning social and economic life and on the need to secure the continuous flow of resources to a set of vital, vulnerable systems. Lakoff also emphasizes the military genealogy of the figure of the essential worker. More generally, one can say that at stake here is an extensive notion of infrastructure. What matters more in the definition of essential workers provided by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is the focus on infrastructure. The focus on an extensive and expanded notion of infrastructures, which includes both traditional as well as digital infrastructure and what we can term biopolitical infrastructures of health and care. I think it is important to stress this mutation and stretching of the notion of infrastructure that has important resonances also in critical studies. Just think of the book by Keller Easterling, Extra-State Power. But again, we are confronted here with the relevance of logistics that is explicitly mentioned in the US as well in other parts of the world with respect to essential work. If we take together infrastructures and logistics, which are not synonymous, of course, but are obviously related, what emerges is the relevance of the sphere of circulation. And I would like to emphasize the issue of circulation that we find at the center of the very definition of essential workers. So I was talking of the widening of the expansion of the notion of infrastructure, well beyond the material networks for transportation, for distribution and communication that make up the traditional notion of infrastructure. Digitalization plays, of course, a very important role here, but also, and this is now even more important for me, the question of care, infrastructures of care, medical and health care are part and parcel of infrastructures of care, of course. And there is no need to stress that medical and health care were particularly stressed by the pandemic. Medical and health care are important aspects of what we can call, in more general terms, social reproduction. And while established systems of reproduction and the gender relations sustaining them were tested by the pandemic, just think of homes during lockdowns and of the even more difficult balance between work and caring for kids. Social reproduction as such emerged even more clearly during the pandemic as the foundation of social and economic life, as both a condition and an operative space for contemporary capital. I could expand here on domestic and care workers as essential workers in many parts of the world. But let me sum up this point by quoting an interesting paper on care penalties in the US. I quote from this paper, nearly half of all essential workers are employed in care services, education, healthcare, and social service industries. And almost 3/4 of all essential care workers are women. I think that if you look at essential workers, as I was proposing before, from the angle of an analysis of the composition of contemporary living labor, this is a crucial point that we have to keep in mind. So what I try to do in my quick analysis of the notion of essential workers was to single out the relevance of circulation and reproduction for the working of contemporary capitalism, and the relevance of labor in circulation and reproduction for the composition of contemporary living labor. In a way, one of the main theses that Brett and I are testing, and that I would very much like to discuss with you today, is that circulation and reproduction, again, the two domains that figure most prominently in the definition of essential workers in the pandemic conjuncture, play new roles in the workings of contemporary capitalism. We can even say that they tend to guide processes of valorization and accumulation of capital, subordinating production itself to the temporality, spatial arrangements, and quote and unquote rationality of circulation and reproduction. It is very important for me to insist on the fact that such a theoretical hypothesis does not imply any underestimation of production, and in particular of manufacturing and industrial activities, as well as of labor struggles in these domains. While there is definitely a need to test and rethink the very notion of production, as well as the ones of circulation and reproduction, this is the wage. We are fully aware of the persistent relevance of production. After all, industrial occupations, for instance, in food processing, semiconductor fabrication, of the pharmaceutical industry, were also deemed essential at the outbreak of the pandemic. When we say that circulation and reproduction tend to guide capitalist development today, we do so on the basis of our reading of the Marxian notion of Gesamtkapital, that we translate as aggregate capital for reasons that we explain in The Politics of Operations, the book we published in 2019. It is within the articulation and composition of aggregate capital that we see circulation and reproduction, which means, of course, capital actors operating in circulation and reproduction as dominant. And what interests us are the new emerging articulations of circulation, reproduction, and production, and even more importantly, the potential and actual articulations of struggles across those domains as a basis for a new politics of liberation. Let me conclude by at least foreshadowing two issues that are particularly relevant for our project, but more generally for any attempt to make sense of the trends that are reshaping capitalism in the pandemic conjuncture. I'm thinking of the future of neoliberalism and of the state. I will be quick so that we have time for discussion. If you look at the new roles of central banks, particularly in the West, if we look at monetary politics, at least since the crisis of 2007, 2008, intensified with the attempt of governments and central banks to cope with the economic and social implications of the pandemic, we can definitely say that we are confronted with profound mutations and even with a crisis of neoliberalism. Sure, we have to look forward, particularly taking carefully into account the dynamic of inflation that we are currently witnessing. But the last 10, 15 years confront us, I repeat, with developments that are very difficult to combine with any kind of supposed neoliberal orthodoxy, particularly from the point of view of monetary politics. Over the last 2 years, many analysts have pointed out that central banks are backing deficit spending of government, which is definitely not compatible with any understanding of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism may be in crisis, yet another crisis, but its scattered elements recombine in new formations at the global level that was constitutive of neoliberalism since its inception. The specific form of neoliberal subjectivity epitomized by the notion of human capital in particular continues to shape recovery and stimulus plans in many parts of the world. Anyway, as we have always been wary of simplistic reconstructions of neoliberalism, rolling back the state, privatizations, deregulation, and the like, we take a distance, Brett and I take a distance today from analysis of its supposed crisis that posits as its logic implication the return of the state of Keynesianism of the welfare state. The point I was touching upon at the very beginning of my talk this afternoon. Again, as several analyses demonstrate, processes of financialization are far from reversed or even slowed down by the impressive monetary measures of the last years, again, particularly in the West. Even recovery plans and relief packages are predicated on efforts to manage the economy by the way of financial markets. And this means underwriting the high-risk investments of hedge funds and other similar investment vehicles. This means that the financial rationality becomes part and parcel of the very working of the very rationality of the state. And this is a situation quite different from the one celebrated by harbingers of the return of the nation state and classical Keynesianism. It is very different because on the one hand, the boundary between the political reason of the state and the financial rationality is blurred. And on the other hand, because the relevance of financial dynamics challenge the very idea of a national economy that was so important for classical Keynesianism. This is not, I want to emphasize it, this is not to deny that the state can play new roles today, even for the politics of liberation. But to put it shortly and to conclude, the condition for that is a multiplication of struggles and mobilizations capable to politicize the new composition of living labor and to open up the spaces for the political invention of new forms of care, welfare, cooperation, and the common. This is once again the collective task to which our work struggles to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro, for this paper. It was very rich and dense. I remind you all that you can post your questions in the question and answers box. I would have two questions for you, Sandro, just to launch the discussion. The first on the concept of class, and the second on the European Union. So, by analyzing the category of essential workers, you have highlighted how, in many cases, these are workers employed in so-called reproductive sectors, logistics, care, health, food production, waste, and so on and so on. So jobs in which exploitation is by definition not dissociated from the dimensions of race and gender. Jobs in which the simultaneity of forms of domination clearly emerges, race, gender, and class. However, very often in the debates on intersectionalism, the emphasis is placed more on the irreducibility than the simultaneity of the dimensions of domination. So the first question I would ask you concerns the theoretical and also the political implications of such an approach. And that's both for the issue of class and that of race and gender. And then the second question about the European Union and the pandemic. You have spoken about the central bank's policies, the crisis of neoliberalism, and the nation state and the role and functions of nation states. So I would like to ask you, what's your opinion about certain functionalist approaches to the relationship between crisis and the construction of the union, whereby it's through crisis that the integration process makes significant leaps forward. You know, according to some scholars, and I think in particular, for example, here in France, Yann Moulier-Boutiang, the overcoming of each critical phase has so far been achieved through a deepening of the integration of common policies. Jan even interprets the pandemic as the historical condition, as the material condition for a federal turnaround. Now, it seems to me that things are not so linear. And also the beginning of the 2010s, for example, the sovereign debt crisis certainly led, as you have said, to a non-conventional turn in the ECB monetary policies, but then it also accentuated different tensions between member countries. And I believe the same. It's true today for the pandemic, which it's a crisis, and the pandemic crisis also within the European context has been graphed onto a multi-layered plurality of different crises that preceded it. Now, what I would ask you is, what is the balance sheet that, in your opinion, can be drawn almost 2 years after the outbreak of the pandemic? And what do you think are today's the union's perspective?
Thank you very much, David. Two important questions, and two very different questions. With respect to the first, I am currently working on the relation between race, gender, and class along the lines that you were suggesting. I'm also trying to discuss the paradigm of intersectionality in an attempt to go beyond the identity politics that often, in a way, paradoxically represent the outcome of intersectionality. Very important from this point of view is precisely to stress the moment of simultaneity in the working of different regimes of oppression as the ones encapsulated by race and gender. For me, we have to go beyond an understanding of capitalism in terms of homogeneity. We have to go beyond the idea according to which the development of capitalism produces a process of homogenization of societies, cultures, political systems. This is a point in which my work on post-colonial criticism is particularly important for me. I have learned from this work to stress the moment of difference in the working of capitalism. What I think it is important to add is that differences that are often exploited by capital work on a plane of immanence in which they are also synchronized by capital. Difference is not only a moment of division of labor, and we know very well that the claim of differences within the composition of labor, within labor struggles, has played important roles in history and continues to play important roles in the present to widen the notion of class and to posit new questions that are crucial questions. Once we stress both the moment of difference and the moment that I was calling before in an abstract way of synchronization, I think we have the conditions to rethink class as a unitary subject that is made up of multiple differences. And I think this is the way in which we have to work both theoretically and politically in a conjuncture in which what Brett and I call the multiplication of labor is intensified. And as you were saying, the moment of gender, the moment of race, sexism, racism come to the fore in the very composition of living labor. It's not the first time of history, of course. This is something that characterizes the history of capitalism since its inception. Just think of the whole discussion surrounding the notion of Russian capitalism. What I say is that today we are confronted with kind of peculiar intensification of the relevance of these moments. But at the same time, we have also behind us the rich history of feminist, anti-racist movements that lay the ground for us to confront this intensification of the multiplication of labor, of sexism, of racism in effective ways. Regarding the European Union, what can I say? You were rightly quoting the functionalist interpretation of European integration as a process that develops through crisis. In a way, one can say that in modern times, there has always been a relation between crisis and transformation and revolution. If you read Thomas Paine, for instance, you can see that connection at work in the time of the American Revolution. But if you read Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, you can also grasp that connection in 1917 in Russia. So let's say that the functionalist interpretation of European integration is a kind of weak inflection of a classical problem at stake in the development of the notion of crisis in European modernity. Regarding today, you know, I think that we cannot evaluate the fact that the reaction of the European Union to the pandemic was quite different from the reaction to the sovereign debt crisis, in particular to the Greek crisis 10 years ago. It was different, and today in the debate among the ruling classes in Europe, the question of a reform of the budgetary rules is a fake, is a very open question, which does not mean that this reform will go in the direction that we can wish. But I don't think that the European Union will go back to the time of fiscal austerity. This is, for me, very difficult to imagine. Let me add two things also with respect to Jan Mulier's positions. There can be a federal term, I mean, but it will not be the outcome of the institutional development, of the institutional dynamics of the European Union. The point is that this reform of the European Union must become a terrain of struggle. Without this, it will be very difficult to have a kind, let's say, of democratic invention from within the structures, the institutional structures of the European Union. Without this element of struggle, of social mobilization, we will have transformations, mutations according to a governmental rationality. So we have to think this moment of insurrection, to put it in emphatic terms, you know, this moment of interaction of the institutional dynamics. And you know, when we talk about the European Union, then people say that what are you thinking of? A huge demonstration in Brussels? This is not the point. This is not the point. You know, what I'm thinking of is the possibility of movements and struggles at the urban level, at the regional level, at the national level, that are able to create a kind of qualitative shift, that are able to sum up and create a European effect. So I'm not naive when I talk about a moment of insurrection at the European level. I'm thinking, to put it in the jargon of European constitutionalism, of a multi-level kind of insurrection movement. Last point, very, very brief on the EU, is that the EU is part of the world. And what is happening at the world level is very important also for the internal development of the European Union. We see these days with respect to Ukraine and the relation between NATO and Russia. And thinking of the relations between NATO and Russia with respect to the EU is particularly complicated because we have let's say, Eastern Europe, most East European member states of the European Union that have a different agenda, that have a different agenda in mind than the agenda of Macron, of Scholz, so there is also a split within the European Union that is doomed to have important consequences also for the questions that we were talking about.
Thanks, Sandro. I'll maybe continue with one or two related questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your accounts of the expanded importance of reproduction and circulation in recent times, and to ask maybe what consequence this has for our understanding of class struggle. So I'm particularly thinking about how, you know, in the past decade or so, there's been various accounts of the idea of circulation struggles. And circulation struggles have sometimes been talked about in relationship to riots, or in relationship to very physical blockades, to the blockage of the movements of goods and so on. And what you described today in the context of the pandemic is a more expanded conception of circulation, which encompasses, as you say, medical workers, service workers, people in all these different sorts of spheres of services and so on. So I'm wondering if the tendency you described of this expanded kind of centrality of circulation, how does that impact what class struggle looks like today? Is the notion of kind of circulation struggles still relevant, or does it mutate in this context?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, Eugene, which is really important. The notion of circulation struggles has played important roles in debates on logistics, in particular in the last 10, 15 years. I'm thinking of the book by Joshua Clover, particular. And I think that the notion of circulation struggles is thought-provoking. So I would work with that notion, but as you rightly said, I think that we have to expand the notion itself with respect to the expansion of the notion of circulation. In particular, Joshua Clover, in a way, reduced to instances of riot, circulation struggles. Circulation struggles are basically blockades. Well, I think that if we reframe the relation between circulation and production, we have to stress the productive dimension of circulation. In front of the productive dimension of circulation, strikes, which for Clover are the other of riots, have important roles to play in circulation struggles. Just think of Amazon, for instance. You know, Amazon is a mega machine that plays important roles in circulation. In particular, through, let's say, e-commerce. Many people tend to reduce Amazon to e-commerce, while we know that today only 50% of the profits of Amazon come from e-commerce. So if we want to confront Amazon, we have to imagine multiple forms and multiple levels of struggle. Among these multiple forms of struggle, strikes are very important. Strikes in the warehouses of Amazon, strikes of the drivers are part and parcel of what I understand as circulation struggles today. At the same time, we know that an increasing part of the profits of Amazon comes from AWS, from Amazon Web Services. In order to confront that part of the operations of Amazon, you have to imagine different forms of struggle. So we cannot find a single form of struggle that is the epitome of circulation struggle. Needless to say, this is an open space of research and practical political experimentation.
A surprising figure in that context in recent times is the teacher, particularly since it's been going on in several years, the kind of the upsurge in teacher strikes, but with the start of the pandemic, obviously, despite the fact of the investment in education and the pejorative treatment of teachers by various national governments, there were suddenly really central figures in managing circulation, the possibility of parents being able to continue work or essential workers in certain contexts, all the sorts of debate and anguish over whether schools will continue to fulfill that function of keeping children or of teachers having kind of leverage in that regard. Maybe just one other question I had, which is slightly different, is just to come back to your remark about the temporality of the present, where you called into question, how crisis can be analytically useful, but it can also be, obviously very hyperbolic and not always apt to describing what's happening in the present moment. And you made this contrast between crisis and acceleration. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what you had in mind there and that opposition between crisis and acceleration and the temporality of the present.
Yes, let me first of all clarify what I mean when I speak of ubiquity of the concept of crisis and of the possibility of an emptying out of that concept due to this ubiquity. I was quoting Thomas Paine and Lenin before. Who definitely play an important role in any conceptual history of crisis in modernity. I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of a German historian, Reinhard Koselleck, who has written extensively on the history of the concept of crisis. And Koselleck stresses in a very interesting way the productivity of crisis in modernity, which means that crisis is something that must be overcome, that must be even emphasized. Both Paine and Lenin emphasized the moment of crisis, but in order to overcome it. And even in economic theory, there has always been a clear-cut divide between crisis and recovery. my point that is not particularly original, I say, is that today this divide, this boundary is blurred. It's blurred. You know, I have many references in mind, of course, but I will mention two of them that are, for me, particularly important. And both refer to the 70s. The first one is the book edited by Stuart Hall, Policing the Crisis, where, in a way, the main point was that crisis had become a condition of governance. It was not something to be overcome. It was rather something to be reproduced in order to reproduce that specific form of government that, as we know, selectively targeted the Black youth and so on. Okay. Another important reference for me comes from the history of Workerism, of autonomist Marxism in Italy. In the early 1970s, the main concept to define the roles of the state in, let's say, Fordism, Keynesianism, was the planning state. The state capable to plan the conditions of capitalist development. But after 73, a discussion started about the crisis of the planned state. And one of the notions that were proposed in order to grasp the nature of the state in the new conjuncture was the notion of crisis state, of a state that used the crisis in order to foster its processes of governmentality. So in both examples, you see the blurring of the boundary between, let's say, crisis and recovery. In both instances, and I repeat, I could multiply them, you see that crisis becomes the horizon of development. So it is in this situation that I think, as a concept, you know, as a theoretical concept, crisis tends to be emptied out. A kind of saturation of the concept of crisis. So as I was saying in my talk, I do not propose the concept of acceleration as an alternative to the concept of crisis. But looking at the transformation of capitalism, at the mutations of capitalism in the pandemic conjuncture, I think that the notion of acceleration is quite effective. Just think of digital platforms, for instance. I mean, we have been confronted with you know, a dramatic acceleration of their operations and of the entrenchment of their operations in the social fabric. So I'm not thinking of a theory of acceleration. I'm not thinking of acceleration, you know. But I think that in this specific case, the notion of acceleration provides us with a tool that allows focusing on the trends that are continuing to shape contemporary capitalism, and not merely on the crisis. I will conclude by making an example that feels important to me. The notion of supply chain disruption, which is, you know, a notion of crisis, of course. If you emphasize that notion, then you think of the crisis of logistics, the force behind supply chain capitalism, to quote Anna Singer, And you don't see the way in which logistics has been able to rearrange, to reorganize its circuits and its operations very quickly in the last 2 years.
Sandro, maybe if you want just one last question by me on workerism and essential worker. You have spoken about essential workers for the reproduction of capital, for social reproductions. So essential workers to understand the functioning of present-day society in terms of technical composition. If we want to use this traditional notion of autonomous Marxism, I would ask you to what extent this allows us to speak again of a sort of coincidence between technical and political compositions. Are these subjectivities which are central, on which one must bet politically, or are the struggles of these workers already quantitatively and qualitatively decisive?
Yes, that's again a very interesting question. You know, I have to say that for many years now, I have attempted to go beyond any emphasis on the distinction between technical and political composition of the working class, of living labor. And particularly if you look at social reproduction, at the figures of labor in social reproduction, you can see very well that the element that was traditionally encapsulated in the notion of political composition, which means ways of life, culture, history of struggles, is immediately incorporated in the technical composition of class, which means in the composition of class that results from a specific system of organization and exploitation of labor. In such figures, it is very difficult to trace a firm boundary between the technical and the political element. And this has to do with the way in which, let's say, subjectivity of the workers is directly invested in production. Again, particularly if we look at social reproduction. A teacher, for instance, that Eugene was mentioning before, but also at nurses, at care workers. This is an element of subjectivity that is not necessarily, you know, a kind of revolutionary element, but this investment of subjectivity challenges the idea of a boundary between, or firm boundary between technical and political composition.
Sandro, we've got a question from the audience, actually, if you'd have time for one more. If you want to take one more.
Of course.
Nice.
I don't see the question.
I can read it out. It's in the Q&A box. It's from Martin O'Shaughnessy, who writes, you mentioned the need for a proliferation of struggles. To what extent is this hypothetical? And to what extent do you see signs of this beginning to arise? If so, in what locations and sectors?
Well, thank you very much. Let me be very honest. My impression is that, particularly in Europe, the pandemic has of spread fear, tiredness across societies. Last year, together with many comrades in Italy, we launched a project, a political project, to foster struggles around welfare, looking at education, healthcare, but also looking at circulation struggles in the sense I was explaining before. And at the beginning, I must say, I was quite optimistic about that. It seemed to me that there was objectively the ground for such struggles. It didn't really work. It didn't really work. It seems to be difficult, at least in Italy, but I think it is a common experience in Europe, to mobilize in this conjuncture. So what I think is that this can be a transitory moment, that we can come out of the pandemic with a different kind of availability to mobilization and struggle. And in the meantime, what we have to do is to look at kind of micro movements, the kind of behaviors that in such sectors in particular as education and healthcare enable the material reproduction of those structures. And this is in a way a classical workerist movement, you know, to look at behaviors, at forms, at practices that do not appear as explicitly political, but nevertheless materially constitute the basis for more explicitly political struggles. I must say that, and now I speak only about Italy, we are confronted with many struggles at the point of production nowadays. And in particular, with many struggles in logistics, in the warehouses of logistics. In those warehouses where the presence of migrants is prevailing. So I think that nowadays we have to look for virtualities. For virtualities. And there are a lot of virtualities. At the same time, we have not to lose sight of the explicit struggles that go on in our societies.
Sandro, we've got another late question where it's an interesting go for one more. So it's actually quite a long comment, and it might be useful for you to read along as I read it out loud. It's in the chat, it's in the Q&A box, in the open questions from Rupert Waldron.
I don't see the Q&A box. What is it?
It's just to the right of the raise hand.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see it.
And Rupert's there in the open Q&A section writes that you make fascinating points on the connection between circulation and biopolitics as a way into understanding the pandemic. The tendency with Marx, already noted in Grundrisse, of circulation increasingly controlling production, and the restructuring of this by the pandemic also seems an extremely interesting way in. Does the notion of social factory help to grasp the process you mentioned by which biopolitical infrastructure reveals a specific importance for capital? If digital platforms aid the roaming of factory-like control, point of production control throughout space and daily life, circulatory domains lose their distinction from productive domains, and the rise of platform labor under the pandemic has increased this. If so, does the state's role in assuring the endurance of capitalism also alter in terms of emphasis accordingly in terms of ensuring sufficient circulation? In the UK, the state has, for example, started to insist that schools force teachers to go into work and recommend that businesses get workers back on site. Universities have started responding to this too, trying to ensure minimum amounts of work time on site in response to government pressure. So does this sphere of activity states are required by capital to enter into, does it change with the extension of capital deeper into the social developments you mentioned? Yeah, a lot in there, but interesting set of questions.
There is another question. Maybe I can do both.
Okay. So yeah, the second one from Mirella, thinking of the organizing that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, the Mondo Cevera movement, but also other grassroots initiatives. Do you feel there's scope for us to be ourselves, the crisis of capitalism in this advanced pandemic conjuncture, or do you feel disappointed, pessimistic about the current state of struggles? So it's a little bit related to the previous question.
Yes, thank you very much for both questions. Rupert, you perfectly get the point. I was struck by your reference to the Grundrisse, because of course we are also trying to reframe the notion of circulation starting from Marx. Not only with Marx, but the point of departure of our attempt to reframe circulation and the relation between circulation, production, and reproduction will start with Marx, with the Grundrisse in particular, but also with the second volume of Capital, and in particular the section on transportation, which is quite interesting attempt by Marx to blur the boundary between production and circulation, because what he says in that section is that there is a moment in circulation that can produce surplus value. The state, yes, I tend to answer in a positive way to your question. I ask myself whether it is possible, to inscribe new contradictions within the structures of the state. Because what you say is definitely right. But is it possible to produce another moment within the workings of the state? This is the question behind what I was saying before about the possibility of using the state within a politics of liberation. I do not have an answer. I think it is important to keep the question open. it is important to keep open the question about the possibility of multiplying, of inscribing and multiplying contradictions within the structures of the state. One could say that the work of Nikos Poulantzas can be inspiring from this point of view. In a way, it can, but we have to remember that Poulantzas was confronted with a very different state. So today, we cannot replicate the kind of contradictions within the state that characterize the age of Keynesianism. We must invent something new, keeping in mind that there is a connection between state and capital that remains stable and hegemonic. And Mirella, yes, I was referring to Il Mondo che Verrà in my reply before. I wouldn't say that I am disappointed or pessimistic. Maybe there was also something wrong in the way in which we imagined the political process that we tried to launch with Il Mondo che Verrà. Il Mondo che Verrà, I say it for people who are not Italian, was an attempt to launch an online assembly at the very beginning of the pandemic, during lockdowns. We did several assemblies with hundreds of people, and the basic idea was to start a mobilization around the issue of welfare. You know, I was one of the people who proposed that, who wrote the political text that we produced in Il Mondo che Verrà. Today I say that maybe welfare did not work very well as a mobilizing keyword. Maybe we should have worked more in order to find a different kind of political language to foster mobilization capable to confront the current conjuncture. So this is a moment of self-critique. I don't know if this was the reason why at the end the project didn't work, but speaking with several people, with several comrades, activists, I noticed that the very term welfare was not really catchy. Let's put it so. Was not really catchy. Of course, we did an effort in the assemblies, in the text that we produced, to explain that we were not thinking of a return to the golden age, the supposed golden age of the welfare state. We explained it, I think, very well from a theoretical point of view, but maybe it didn't work politically. So regarding the present, I don't want to say that I am disappointed or pessimistic. Let's say that I'm trying to think also together with friends and comrades of a different kind of temporality. With Il Mondo che Verrà, the idea was that the pandemic is the moment in which we can launch a big movement also beyond the divides of the last years and so on. In a way, we were thinking like Davide was saying regarding Yamuye Butang. It didn't work. So we have to think of a different temporality. We have to think of a moment of preparation that can lay the ground for new mobilizations that will. This is something I'm quite sure about, you know.
Okay, our time's almost up, so I think we'll draw to a close there. Sandro, thanks so much for a really fascinating talk and your generosity going through all these questions.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks as ever to Eric Erdl at ULUP for organising and facilitating these events. I posted details in the chat box of our next talk, which is with Aaron Benenev. The title is Post-Scarcity Economics, Foundations of Life After Capitalism. It takes place on the 18th of February. And if you follow the link, you can register for that talk there. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Have a good weekend. Cheers again, Sandro.
Thank you very much.